He said, "You're lucky I married you poor. So I left him with nothing but bills. I never thought I would be betrayed by someone I loved, especially not in front of so many people." But there I was, standing in our kitchen on a Tuesday evening, watching my husband Marcus count bills at our dining table while his mother sat across from him. Her lips pursed in that familiar expression of disapproval she reserved just for me. "You're lucky I married you poor," Marcus said without looking up, his fingers methodically sorting through our monthly expenses. "At least now you have someone to take care of you." The words hit me like ice water. Our friends from next door had stopped by to borrow some sugar, and they stood frozen in our doorway, witnessing this moment that would replay in my mind for months to come. I felt my cheeks burn with shame as I watched their expressions shift from friendly smiles to uncomfortable pity. It wasn't just the humiliation of those words, it was the casual way he said them, as if my worth could be measured in dollars and cents. As if the 3 years I'd spent building our life together, the meals I'd cooked, the home I'd created, the emotional support I'd given him through his job losses and family drama, meant nothing because I'd come from less. His mother nodded approvingly, and I realized this wasn't the first time they'd discussed my financial inadequacy. The weight of their judgment settled on my shoulders like a heavy coat I couldn't remove. I stood there, feeling invisible despite being the center of their attention, and something inside me began to shift. It was subtle at first, a small voice that whispered, "You don't deserve this." But it grew stronger as I watched Marcus hand his mother some cash, probably for her weekly shopping, while I'd been clipping coupons and skipping lunches to help our budget stretch. I had always prided myself on being understanding, on being the peacemaker, on letting things slide for the sake of harmony. But as our neighbors awkwardly excused themselves, and I heard them whispering on their way back to their house, I realized that my silence had been mistaken for acceptance. The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, suffocating. I could feel my heart racing, not with fear, but with something I hadn't felt in years. Anger. Real justified anger. Not the kind that burns hot and disappears, but the kind that settles deep in your bones and demands action. Marcus looked up finally, saw my expression, and had the audacity to seem confused. "What?" he asked, as if he genuinely didn't understand why I might be upset. That night, as I lay in our bed, listening to him snore peacefully beside me, I stared at the ceiling and felt something crystallizing inside me. I had a choice to make. I could continue to let his words and his mother's judgment define my worth, or I could choose to change everything. I didn't know how it would unfold, but one thing was clear: my life would never be the same again. The question that kept me awake wasn't whether I deserved better. I was finally beginning to understand that I did. The question was, will I choose to stay silent, or will I take control of my own story? That sleepless night opened a floodgate of memories I'd carefully locked away. As I lay there in the darkness, I began to see a pattern that had been invisible to me before, or maybe I just refused to acknowledge it. There was the time Marcus forgot to mention his promotion at work until I overheard him bragging about his new salary to his brother. When I asked him about it later, he shrugged and said, "I didn't think you'd understand the corporate stuff anyway." The dismissal in his voice had stung, but I'd convinced myself he was just being protective. Then there was our second anniversary dinner, when he spent the entire evening on his phone, texting his mother about her latest drama with the neighbors. I dressed up, made reservations at the restaurant where we'd had our first date, and sat across from him, feeling like I was dining alone. When I gently asked if we could put the phones away, he looked at me like I was being unreasonable. "Family comes first, Sarah. You should understand that by now." The financial humiliations had started small. He'd begun handling all our bills after we moved in together, saying he was better with numbers. I'd been grateful at first, one less thing to worry about. But gradually I realized I had no idea where our money went. When I asked to see our budget, he'd wave me off. "Don't worry your pretty little head about it. I've got everything under control." Pretty little head. Those words echoed now with a cruelty I hadn't recognized then. I remembered the holiday party at his office last year, where I'd spent an hour getting ready, excited to meet his colleagues. But when we arrived, he introduced me simply as Sarah to everyone else's titles and accomplishments. His boss's wife was Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the cardiologist. His colleague's partner was Tom, who runs his own consulting firm. I was just Sarah, no context, no value, no identity beyond being Marcus's accessory. The worst part wasn't even the introductions, it was how natural it felt to shrink into the background, to smile politely while conversations flowed around me like I wasn't there. I'd learned to make myself smaller, quieter, less challenging. When had that happened? The emotional scars ran deeper than I'd realized. Each dismissal, each casual cruelty, each moment of being made to feel invisible had layered on top of the others, until I'd forgotten what it felt like to take up space in my own life. I'd become an expert at swallowing my needs, my opinions, my very sense of self. His mother's constant commentary about my appearance, my cooking, my housekeeping, all delivered with that sweet smile that made objecting seem petty. Marcus never defended me. In fact, sometimes he'd nod along, adding his own helpful suggestions about how I could improve. I'd started believing their narrative about me, that I was lucky to be tolerated, grateful to be chosen, fortunate to be provided for. The woman who had once dreamed of starting her own business, who had graduated summa cum laude, who had friends who valued her opinion, where had she gone? As dawn broke through our bedroom window, I realized the truth that terrified me most. I had become complicit in my own erasure. Every time I'd stayed silent, every time I'd smiled through the hurt, every time I'd told myself, it's not that bad, I'd handed over another piece of myself. The question haunting me now wasn't just about taking control of my story. It was deeper than that. Can I confront the hidden wounds, or will they remain buried forever? 3 days after that sleepless night, I found myself standing in front of our bathroom mirror, really looking at myself for the first time in months. The woman staring back at me seemed like a stranger, shoulders hunched forward, eyes that had lost their spark, a practiced smile that never quite reached them. When had I started carrying myself like I was apologizing for existing? I traced the reflection of my face with my finger against the cool glass. This wasn't who I used to be. The Sarah from 5 years ago wouldn't have tolerated being called lucky to be married poor. She would have had words. She would have demanded respect. She would have never allowed herself to become so small. That morning, Marcus had left early for work without saying goodbye. Not unusual anymore. His mother had called 3 times before 9 a.m., each conversation ending with him promising to talk to Sarah about something I was apparently doing wrong. The groceries I'd chosen, the way I'd arranged the living room furniture, my antisocial behavior at the neighbor's barbecue last weekend. As I listened to him placate her on that 3rd call, something inside me snapped into perfect clarity. I was done being the subject of their conversations rather than a participant in my own life. I walked to our home office, well, Marcus's home office that I was allowed to use sometimes, and opened my laptop. My hands shook slightly as I logged into the banking website. The password was still what I'd set it as years ago, back when we'd first opened our joint account as equal partners. What I saw there took my breath away. Our savings account, the one I'd been contributing to with my part-time job earnings, had significantly more money than I'd realized. Marcus had been telling me we were barely scraping by, that we couldn't afford things, like a new laptop for my freelance work, or even a dinner out for my birthday. Yet here was evidence of a comfortable cushion he'd kept hidden from me. I printed out 3 months of bank statements, my jaw tightening with each transaction I discovered. Regular transfers to his personal account I didn't even know he had. Monthly payments to his mother that dwarfed our grocery budget. Charges at restaurants I'd never been to. Probably business lunches he'd never mentioned. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about the lie. The carefully constructed narrative that I was a financial burden, that I should be grateful for his support, that I couldn't be trusted with real information about our life together. I sat back in his ergonomic chair, looking at the evidence spread across his desk, and felt something powerful rising in my chest. Not rage exactly, but something cleaner and more focused. Determination. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a different life. Not just a life without Marcus, but a life where I made my own decisions, kept my own counsel, answered to no one but myself. A life where I could take up space again. I opened a new browser window and started researching. Apartment listings, divorce lawyers, my old college roommate's phone number. Each click felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd forgotten existed. The scared voice in my head whispered about security, about starting over, about proving his mother right, about my inability to manage on my own. But a louder voice, one I barely recognized as my own, cut through the fear with crystal clarity. You already know how to survive. You've been surviving this for years. The plan began forming as I sat there, not born from anger, but from self-preservation and long overdue self-respect. I wasn't going to confront him in the heat of emotion. I wasn't going to give him the chance to gaslight me or minimize what I'd discovered. I was going to be strategic, careful, and completely prepared. But as I started making my first real decision in years, one question remained. Can I find the courage to change my life, or will I hesitate when it matters most? Over the next 2 weeks, I became a woman I didn't recognize, and for the first time in years, I liked who I was becoming. Methodical, strategic, quiet in my purpose. I created a timeline. Marcus would be traveling for work in 3 weeks, a 4-day conference in Chicago that his mother had already announced she'd be visiting during, ostensibly to keep me company, but really to rifle through our home and report back on my shortcomings. Perfect. I opened my own checking account at a different bank, went closer to the downtown area where I'd started looking at apartments. The young banker who helped me was kind and efficient, treating me like any other customer opening an account. No condescension, no assumption that I needed someone else's permission. It was such a small thing, but as I walked out with my temporary debit card, I felt like I was practicing being a person again. The research phase became my secret obsession. I documented everything. Screenshots of our financial accounts, photos of the bank statements, records of every disparaging comment his mother made during her daily phone calls. I'd learned to be invisible in my own home, and now I use that invisibility as a weapon, moving through our shared space like a ghost gathering evidence. I reached out to Elena, my college roommate who'd become a successful attorney. When I called her, my voice shook at first, but she listened without judgment as I explained my situation. "Sarah," she said gently, "I've been wondering when you'd call. I've been worried about you for years." That conversation lasted 3 hours. Elena walked me through my options, explained my rights, and recommended a colleague who specialized in family law. By the end of the call, I had appointments scheduled and a clear understanding of what I could expect. Knowledge became my armor. The apartment hunting was the hardest part, not because I couldn't find anything suitable, but because I kept second-guessing myself. Looking at studio apartments and small one-bedrooms, I'd hear Marcus's voice in my head. "You can't even manage our household budget. How will you handle rent on your own?" But then I'd remember the bank statements hidden in my laptop bag, the proof of his deception, and my resolve would harden. I found a perfect one-bedroom in a complex with a pool and a small fitness center, and I put down a deposit using money from my secret account. The lease would start the day after he returned from Chicago. I practiced the conversation in my head during my morning walks. Not an emotional confrontation, but a clear statement of facts and decisions already made. I rehearsed staying calm when he inevitably tried to turn the tables, when he'd accuse me of being unreasonable or ungrateful. I prepared for his mother's involvement, for the guilt trips, for the promises to change. But the most crucial part of my plan wasn't about him at all. It was about me. I'd spent so many years seeking permission, approval, validation from others that I'd forgotten how to trust my own judgment. This plan was my way of proving to myself that I could think clearly, act decisively, and follow through on my own choices. I started small acts of rebellion that felt enormous to me. I bought groceries I wanted to eat instead of just what was on sale. I rearranged the living room furniture without asking anyone's opinion. I called old friends and made plans that didn't include Marcus or require his approval. Each small act of independence felt like flexing a muscle that had been dormant too long. I was remembering who I used to be, but more importantly, I was discovering who I could become. The question that haunted my carefully laid plans wasn't about logistics or timing. Those I had under control. It was something deeper. Will I feel victorious when it's over, or will the consequences leave me feeling empty? Marcus returned from Chicago on a Thursday evening, tired and slightly irritated that I hadn't prepared his favorite welcome home dinner. He dropped his suitcase in the hallway and headed straight for the shower, calling over his shoulder, "Mom said she stopped by while I was gone. She mentioned you were acting strange." I waited until he was settled in his recliner with a beer, scrolling through his phone with that familiar expression of mild annoyance at the world. The living room felt different now. I'd already mentally removed myself from it, and the furniture seemed like props in someone else's life. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. He glanced up, already looking exasperated. "If this is about whatever my mother said, it's not." I sat across from him, the manila folder in my lap feeling both weightless and heavy as a stone. "It's about our marriage, our finances, and the fact that it's over." The words hung in the air between us like a declaration of war. Marcus blinked, his beer halfway to his lips, clearly trying to process what I'd just said. "Sarah, what are you talking about? Did you have a bad week while I was gone? You know you get anxious when I travel." I opened the folder and pulled out the bank statements, laying them on the coffee table between us with the precision of a lawyer presenting evidence. "You've been lying to me about our finances for years." His face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and then a flash of something that looked almost like respect before settling into defensive anger. "You went through our accounts, Marcus, the ones with my name on them. The ones I've been contributing to while you told me we were broke." My voice remained calm, factual. "I'd practiced this. The ones you've been using to support your mother while telling me I couldn't afford a laptop for my work." He set down his beer and leaned forward, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. "Sarah, honey, you don't understand how financial planning works. There are things I handle because you thought I was too stupid to notice." I pulled out the printed emails from his personal account, the ones I'd accessed using the laptop he'd carelessly left logged in. "Or because you thought I'd never find out about the apartment you've been looking at, the one you were planning to move us to without consulting me?" The color drained from his face. Those emails had been my smoking gun. Correspondence with a realtor about a smaller, cheaper place that would be perfect for downsizing while he kept our current home as a rental property. He'd been planning to relocate me without my knowledge, probably presenting it as financial necessity. "I can explain. You don't need to explain anything." I stood up, feeling taller than I had in years. "I've already spoken with a lawyer. I've already found my own place. I'm filing for divorce, and I'm taking half of everything, the half that was always mine to begin with." Marcus stood too, his beer forgotten, his face cycling through disbelief and anger. "You can't just... This is ridiculous. You're being hysterical. We can work this out." "I'm not hysterical. I'm done." The words came out with a finality that surprised even me. "I've spent 3 years making myself smaller for you, Marcus. I'm not going to spend one more day disappearing in my own life." His phone buzzed, probably his mother calling for her evening check-in. He ignored it, staring at me like I was a stranger. In that moment, I realized that's exactly what I was. The woman he'd been trying to shape and control no longer existed. The question echoing in my mind as I walked toward our bedroom to pack wasn't about victory anymore. It was simpler and more complex. Will I feel relieved after this, or will it leave me questioning everything? 2 weeks later, I sat in my new apartment, surrounded by boxes I hadn't yet found the energy to unpack, staring at my phone as it buzzed with another call from Marcus's mother. I'd stopped answering 3 days ago, but she kept trying. The voicemails had evolved from furious accusations to tearful pleas to thinly veiled threats about what people would think. The silence in my one-bedroom apartment was supposed to feel like freedom, but instead it felt hollow. The confrontation had gone exactly as I'd planned. Marcus had been caught completely off guard, had tried every manipulation tactic in his arsenal, and had ultimately been forced to accept the reality I'd presented him with. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I felt strangely empty. My lawyer had called that morning with good news. Marcus had agreed to the divorce terms without much fight, probably realizing that contesting them would only expose more of his financial deceptions. The house would be sold, assets divided, and I'd walk away with enough money to start fresh. It was everything I'd wanted, so why did I feel like I was floating through someone else's life? I'd spent weeks focused on proving him wrong, on showing him that I wasn't the helpless woman he'd tried to convince me I was. But sitting alone with my victory, I realized I'd been fighting his definition of me rather than discovering my own. The entire revenge plot had still been about him, his opinion, his reaction, his comeuppance. Elena called while I was contemplating the boxes of my life scattered across the living room floor. "How are you feeling?" she asked, and I found myself unable to give the triumphant answer I'd expected. "I don't know," I admitted. "I thought I'd feel stronger, more satisfied. But mostly I just feel tired." There was a pause before Elena spoke again, her voice gentle but knowing. "Sarah, can I ask you something? When you were planning all of this, what did you think would happen after? Once you'd proven your point and walked away?" The question hit me like cold water. I'd been so focused on the execution of my plan that I'd never really thought about what came next. What did I want my life to look like beyond not being married to Marcus? "I spent so much energy on making him pay for what he did," I said slowly, "but I don't think I ever figured out what I actually wanted for myself." The truth of it settled over me like a weight. I'd become an expert at planning his downfall, but I'd never asked myself who I wanted to be once I was free. The apartment felt like a waiting room rather than a home, and I realized I'd been living in reaction to him for so long that I'd forgotten how to live for myself. Marcus had texted earlier, not an apology but a complaint about having to explain our divorce to his mother. Even now, his primary concern was managing her disappointment rather than examining his own behavior. Reading that text, I'd felt a flash of the old anger, but underneath it was something sadder, pity. Pity for him, trapped in patterns he probably didn't even recognize. Pity for his mother, whose need to control had created a son incapable of real partnership. And pity for myself, because I'd spent so much time and energy on people who would never give me what I needed. The revenge had been satisfying in the moment, watching his face as his carefully constructed lies crumbled. But revenge, I was learning, was still about the other person. It was still letting them define the terms of your healing. Sitting in my quiet apartment, surrounded by the physical evidence of my new independence, I wondered if I'd simply traded one kind of cage for another. I'd escaped Marcus's definition of me, but had I found my own? The question that kept me awake that night wasn't about Marcus or his mother or what anyone thought about my choices. It was deeper and more personal. Has revenge really brought me peace, or is there more healing to be done? It was a Saturday morning 3 months later when everything finally clicked into place. I was sitting in the small cafe around the corner from my apartment, the one I'd discovered during my daily walks, working on a freelance project that actually excited me. The laptop Marcus had said we couldn't afford sat open in front of me, and I was designing a website for a local non-profit, work that felt meaningful in a way my old job never had. The morning sun streamed through the cafe windows, and I realized I hadn't thought about Marcus or his mother in days. Not out of forced effort or deliberate avoidance, but simply because my mind had been occupied with other things, better things, my own things. Elena had been right when she'd suggested I try therapy. Not because there's anything wrong with you, she'd said, but because you spent so long being someone else's version of yourself that you might need help remembering who you really are. Dr. Martinez had been gentle but direct during our sessions. She'd helped me see that the revenge, while satisfying, had been a necessary step but not a destination. You proved you could fight back, she'd said during our last session. Now you need to prove to yourself that you can build something new. That building process had been slower and quieter than the dramatic confrontation with Marcus, but it had been infinitely more rewarding. I'd reconnected with old friends who reminded me of the person I used to be, curious, ambitious, funny in ways that didn't require putting myself down. I'd taken a pottery class just because I'd always wanted to try it. I'd started reading books again, real books that challenged me instead of the mindless fiction I'd escaped into during the worst years of my marriage. Most importantly, I'd learned to sit with silence without needing to fill it with worry about someone else's opinion of me. The previous week, I'd run into Marcus at the grocery store. My first instinct had been to avoid him, to duck down another aisle, but instead I'd simply nodded hello and continued shopping. He'd looked tired, older somehow, and had mumbled something about hoping I was doing okay. There was no anger in that moment. No satisfaction in seeing him diminish, just neutrality, like encountering any other stranger from my past. That interaction had shown me how far I'd traveled. 6 months ago, the thought of running into him would have sent me into days of anxiety and rehearsed conversations. Now, he was simply someone I used to know, someone who had played a role in my story but no longer defined it. I closed my laptop and looked around the cafe. There was the elderly man who came in every morning to read his newspaper and flirt harmlessly with Rosa, the barista. There was the young mother who worked on her graduate thesis while her toddler napped in his stroller. There was the group of friends who met for their weekend book club, their animated discussions about literature spilling over to neighboring tables. I belonged here, in this scene of ordinary contentment. Not because someone had granted me permission, but because I'd chosen it. Because I'd finally learned the difference between proving my worth to others and simply knowing it myself. The freelance work was going well enough that I was considering making it full-time. I'd started dating, nothing serious yet, but the simple act of getting to know new people as the person I was now, rather than the person I'd been in my marriage, felt like a revelation. I'd even begun looking at larger apartments, maybe something with a small office space where I could grow my business. These weren't dramatic changes, but they were deeply mine. Each decision came from asking myself what I wanted, rather than what would avoid conflict or meet someone else's expectations. It was a quieter kind of empowerment than I'd imagined, but it was real and it was sustainable. The question that had haunted me for months, whether I was ready to move forward, was beginning to answer itself. Am I ready to move forward, or is there still something I need to let go of? 1 year later, I stood in my new home office, looking out at the small garden I'd planted behind my townhouse. The cherry tree I'd put in last spring was beginning to bloom, its delicate pink flowers a promise that some things grow more beautiful with time and patience. The papers on my desk weren't bills I was afraid to open or legal documents. From my divorce, they were contracts for my graphic design business, which had grown beyond anything I'd imagined possible. 3 employees now worked with me, and we just signed our biggest client yet. But more than the success, I loved the work itself. The creative problem-solving, the collaboration with people who valued my ideas. My phone buzzed with a text from David, the man I'd been seeing for the past 6 months. "Still on for dinner tonight?" Followed by a photo of him at the farmer's market, holding up 2 different types of flowers and looking genuinely uncertain about which I'd prefer. The simple fact that he asked, that he considered my preferences worth knowing, still sometimes caught me off guard. "Either one," I texted back. "Or both. I love that you even thought to ask. The difference between this relationship and my marriage wasn't just that David respected me, though he did, completely. It was that I'd learned to respect myself enough to only accept what I deserved. I no longer needed someone else's validation to know my own worth, which meant I could receive love freely rather than desperately. I walked to my kitchen to start preparing for a dinner party I was hosting that evening. Elena was coming, along with Dr. Martinez and her husband David, and 2 new friends from my pottery class. The thought of filling my home with people I genuinely enjoyed, conversations that energized rather than drained me, food I'd chosen to make because I wanted to, it all felt like a small miracle. As I arranged flowers in a vase, the ones David had texted about because he'd ended up buying both, I thought about Marcus for the first time in months. Not with anger or regret, but with something approaching gratitude. His betrayal had been the catalyst I'd needed to discover who I really was, beneath all the years of trying to be who others wanted me to be. The divorce had been finalized months ago. I'd heard through mutual friends that he'd moved in with his mother temporarily and was dating someone new, someone he'd apparently met at work. I felt only compassion for that unknown woman, hoping she was stronger than I'd been, hoping she'd recognize her own worth before it was too late. The evening light filtered through my kitchen windows, warming the space I'd created entirely according to my own taste. No compromises, no negotiations, no second-guessing whether my choices would meet someone else's approval. Every dish in my cabinets, every piece of art on my walls, every book on my shelves, all of it reflected the woman I'd discovered myself to be. As my guests began arriving, filling my home with laughter and genuine affection, I realized the last question that had been lingering in my mind had finally been answered. I was no longer asking whether I was ready to move forward or whether there was something left to let go of. I was simply living. Fully, authentically, peacefully living the life I'd chosen for myself. The woman who had once felt lucky to be married to someone who diminished her was gone. In her place stood someone who knew without question that she was enough, exactly as she was becoming.